Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 240. How do you make compelling visualizations that best convey the story of your data? What methods can you employ with popular Python tools to improve your plots and graphs? This week on the show, Matt Harrison returns to discuss his new book, Effective Visualization, Exploiting Matplotlib and Pandas. As a data scientist and instructor, Matt has been teaching the concepts of managing tabular data and making visualizations for over 20 years. Matt shares his methodology for taking a basic plot and then telling a compelling story with it. We discuss why you should limit your plot types to a few that your audience is familiar with. We cover the resources built into Pandas and Matplotlib and some of the library's limitations. Matt talks about the professionally produced plots that inspired him and the process of recreating them. He also answers questions about finding data sources to practice these techniques with. This episode is sponsored by Postman. Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform, and they just launched Postman AI Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. Start building at postman.com/podcast/Python. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Matt, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Excited to be here.
Yeah. It's been fun watching you from afar. I joined Blue Sky recently, I guess you'd say that, kind of with the whole exodus of other people. And how's your experience been there in social media land?
Crazy. Yeah. I'm on Blue Sky and I feel like it's different. It seems a little calmer and I'm kind of feeling the water, see how it goes there.
Yeah. I'm actually enjoying, I'm getting people asking questions, which is new for me. And please keep it up, audience, if you're interested in asking questions about an episode and so forth. I definitely read them, and I'm excited about that. So that's been fun.
Cool.
Yeah, I didn't get as much of that. I enjoyed Mastodon, but it's mostly I would just talk to people I've interviewed before or something like that. So, well, last time you were on, it was episode 169. We were talking about your XGBoost book. How'd the book do?
It did good. One thing that was interesting to me was I think there's a lot of interest, it seems, from companies to apply that. And I guess I would say a lot of companies they don't necessarily want this information to go out, but a lot of them they've got really low hanging fruit. They've got a lot of data sitting around in spreadsheets or in databases, and they're not doing much with it, right?
Okay.
So there has been quite an interest from companies who are like, hey, we got this. Can you help us do something with it? So that's been kind of fun.
That gets you a leg in with the rest of the work that you do.
Getting a leg in, but also seeing that these boosting technologies are really powerful and work in a lot of different domains. So
yeah. The reason I brought it up was that I saw on Blue Sky that you had a new book that you're working on, and it's on a topic that I'm a big fan of, and I talk about a lot on the show. I guess between the two Christophers, when we do our shows about that, I'm the visualizations guy. So yeah, you want to give the title of the new book?
Yeah, the new book is called Effective Visualization, and the subtitle is Exploiting Matplotlib and Pandas.
Yeah. I was intrigued by that, and you have a nice introduction where you sort of say, well, why? Why do you focus on Matplotlib and then why on Pandas? I actually want to start with the Pandas one because you just did a book on polars. I think maybe was that later in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
What were reasons for focusing on Pandas in this particular book?
Yeah. My take on that is not that I don't like polars. I think polars is awesome, and it's learned a lot of I guess, valuable lessons from Pandas and friends.
Mhm.
But Pandas right now is the lingua franca, I would say, of the Python data science world.
Yeah.
And similar to, no one got fired for buying IBM back in the day. That they used to say that.
Yeah.
And probably a lot of people don't even know what IBM is who are listening to this. But Pandas has kind of a good foothold in industry all over the place. And so a lot of people use Pandas. They have a lot of code in Pandas. And to be honest, for a lot of small data tasks, Pandas works great. It's sufficient.
Yeah.
It also has a lot of third-party libraries that work well with it. And so I think it's a good common denominator. I would also say that if you're a polars person, you're probably advanced enough such that you can take the Pandas concepts from the book and
Right.
apply them without too much of a problem.
So one advantage of having Pandas, and maybe you can clarify this for me, is that it has Matplotlib inside of it, or is it all of it or not?
Yeah. So one of the reasons I like Pandas, and this is actually different in polars, is that Pandas has a plotting function or method, has a plotting method, and it wraps Matplotlib in there. So when you say, does it have all of Matplotlib in there? Well, that's a tricky question.
Okay.
There's 13 or so different plotting methods in Pandas. And I find that often for me, it's easier to make a Matplotlib plot using Pandas than it is using Matplotlib, if that makes sense. It's just more natural.
So not importing it as an...
Yeah, I've got the data sitting around in Pandas already. So I just tack on a plot, and if I want to do a scatter plot, I say which two columns I want to scatter plot. Or if I want to do a line plot, I stick whatever I want the x-axis into the index and call plot on it, get a line plot, which is really easy versus pulling things out and then calling the Matplotlib interfaces to create those plots.
Is that your approach in this book?
Yeah, my approach in the book is, well, first of all, I want to give people an understanding of how Matplotlib works. And Matplotlib, like I said, is a pretty, I would say, big library. And it has multiple layers as well.
Yeah.
So Matplotlib is available from Pandas, but you don't have the full access to all of the capabilities of Matplotlib from Pandas, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So what I find is, from my work, oftentimes a quick and dirty plot from Pandas is sufficient.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of done with it there. But oftentimes I want to take the plot to what I'd say the next level, depending on who my audience is. And if I want to start tweaking it, I don't really have that capability from Pandas.
Okay.
But what Pandas gives you when you call the plotting method in Pandas is it gives you a Matplotlib object. And from that object, it's all just Matplotlib. So do I use the Pandas interface all the time, or do I use the Matplotlib interface? Generally, I use the Pandas interface to make the initial plot, and then I will often augment that with Matplotlib on top of that.
Yeah. I'd like to take you back a little bit.
Yeah.
Very often I bring guests on, and instead of talking about how they got involved in programming, or lately I've been asking people how they got involved in open source. As a teacher, one of the things that you mentioned in kind of some different areas, I think in some of the marketing that you have for the book, that you've been teaching visualizations for a long time. And so I kind of wanted to get an idea, what you mean by that. Were you using other tools earlier? What's your background on making visualizations and teaching about them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would say most of my teaching focus these days is around tabular data.
Okay.
So stuff that fits in, like I said, a SQL database or Excel spreadsheet or a CSV. And so when I teach visualization, it's generally from that lens, from people who have data in Pandas generally, and they need to visualize that, exploratory data analysis, or they're doing visualizations to tell a story, or they need to understand a machine learning model or evaluate a machine learning model, and visualizations are a great way to do that as well.
Yeah.
But I think even for like a normal software developer, like I've literally found bugs in code by visualizing things that I don't think I would have ever been able to find if I didn't visualize that.
So you're finding like outliers and things or stuff like that, or?
Well, the issue, so this is when I worked for a hardware company, and we were doing a bunch of testing of solid state storage devices, and some of them were failing when we were doing this infant mortality test at a different rate.
Yeah.
And it was really confusing. Like, why are they failing at a different rate? And so we did some plots about all of the servers, and servers had different slots. We would put in these cards into them. And it turned out that the different slots had different capabilities, like PCIe capabilities, such that the hardware was actually different and getting tested differently depending on where you put it into the slot. And
yeah.
folks had no clue, right? And we're like, what's going on here? And then we visualized it, and you could see like in certain slots, the error rate went up, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, okay. Yeah, this told the story. And without doing that visualization, it would have been hard to tell that story.
Yeah.
But I've been using Matplotlib actually since probably around 2006 or so.
Okay.
So because I recently revisited a project that I worked on with it, and the code still works,
Okay.
Almost 20 years later. So
yeah, that's impressive.
Yeah.
All the different, I'm guessing you've seen lots of changes across the library in those 20 odd years.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of change, but I think a lot of it is more so maybe off in the weeds or like small niceties that aren't big things, right? And
Okay.
I think one of the points in my book is that worrying about odd types of visualizations is probably not super important for folks. Like supporting some obscure visualization type. If you don't know how to use like a line plot or a scatter plot well, you probably should focus on getting those down first before jumping into the fancy stuff.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Getting a comfort level with some sort of standard plots that people have been using across time that you see often, be it not only with scientific reports or whatever, but just even, you'd see in the newspaper back in the day, or you'd see in a magazine or something like that. It's something that I think most people can quickly, again, visualize and, get an idea of it. So once you get into these other interesting areas, it's like, well, what am I even looking at? Like, what is a violin? Like, what is it trying to do for me? And that gets really interesting. And yeah, it's like its own learning curve.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think especially with AI, where we have the ability to, have AI help us out with things, if I can augment some of that storytelling or improve the storytelling using these basic plots, you're going to be more effective, because the basic plots tend to be simple and straightforward and not require a lot of, I guess, hand holding or a lot of explanation on how to use them.
Yeah.
So part of the impetus of the book is, again, focus on the basics and learn to talk to your audience and help your audience see these insights that you can find using these familiar plots.
One of the things that you talked about is that there is a lot of almost sort of documentation or books that are written in a way that they're basically giving you like theory, almost kind of like how a paper would be written, but they're not giving you guidance on actually how to tell the story or construct a visualization. Can you give an example of that? Like, did you run across some of these things in your own research and doing this book where you're like, this is the direction that I don't want to go in?
Yeah. So yeah, part of the impetus for the book, oftentimes my books are scratching my itches, where it's like, this is the book that I would have wanted.
Okay.
And I've got in my bookshelf, I've got a bunch of books back there that talk about what good visualizations are, what are the components of good visualizations. And so they go over this theory. And, I've got books from like 1950, books from 1970, books from 2000s, and a lot of them are sort of saying the same things. But those books don't cover tools. They're like, this is just a book to show you how to do things,
right,
or tell you what the theory is, right?
Okay.
Which is good, I think. Like, I think a lot of people like going to school and learning theory is good. But I think people learn better when they can practice it. So whether you can practice it on your data or someone else's data or your work data, that's better. And then, so that's on one end of the extreme. And then the other side, I think, is there are books out there that are like, here's Matplotlib or some plotting library, and here's how you make plots with it.
Right.
But they don't necessarily talk about like, what is a good plot or characteristics of a good plot. They just say, here's how you make a plot.
Okay.
And certainly, like, if you looked at like even like my pandas book, it's like, yeah, this is how you make a plot with pandas, right? And it shows some plots, but it doesn't really go into what makes a good plot. So I felt like there's a lot of theory books. There's some books that talk about libraries, but there's not really a book that I'm aware of that talks about, here's real world examples of taking data and visualizing it and applying the theory to it, if that makes sense.
Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform. Trusted by over 35 million developers and 500,000 organizations worldwide. They just launched Postman AI Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. With centralized access to the latest LLMs and APIs from over 1,800 companies, plus no-code workflows, you can quickly connect critical tools and build multi-step agents, all without writing a single line of code. Start building smarter agents today with Postman. Visit postman.com/podcast/Python today. That's postman.com/podcast/Python. I like how you started the book with this section, not only just sort of like giving an introduction to like, okay, this is the kind of stuff we're going to cover. And that's where you talked a little bit about the, types of books that you had kind of come across, and the fact that your stuff we've already just talked about, why you're focusing on pandas and why you're focusing on Matplotlib. But then you have this section that says plots I appreciate. And I thought that was really kind of cool. And do you want to talk a little bit about the decision process there and what that chapter or that section's about?
Yeah. So part of my process was, okay, if I want to make a book about visualization, I do want to distill some of the theory in there, but I want to show real world examples of how to do that. And so what I did was I went through like news sources or social media or whatnot and looked for examples of visualizations that I liked.
Yeah.
And so I have, in a virtual scrapbook or whatever, I have a bunch of visualizations and I just gathered them. So I have bookmarks with a ton of different visualizations. And then I went to a bunch of media sites and looked at their visualization teams. I looked at other, there's consulting shops that offer visualization services or whatnot. And I went through their examples. And I just first went out and collected all these types of visualizations.
Okay.
And then I did some, arranging of them or sorting of them, right? And I said, okay, let's look and see what's going on here. And I would say there's different grades of visualizations, right? And there's like, a one-liner, right? And then there's something that's like appearing in, some published magazine or online newspaper or something like that.
Right.
And so I tried to focus more on like, I would say the more professional quality ones rather than like just the one-liner types, and sort of pick apart what I liked about those. And so basically after I did that process, I came up with, there was like 5 buckets of plots. And that was line plots, scatter plots, bar plots, histograms. And I'm going to say the 5th bucket is kind of everything else.
Okay.
Where everything else might be something like a map, but sometimes you will see some sort of weird plot that someone is doing that you might not be aware of. But there are sort of a bunch of different things in that other bucket, right? Where it's like, oh, okay. So it's like, as an educator, what do I want to cover, right? And I looked at I sort of said, okay, that fifth bucket is like kind of like very specialized plots. And it's like, if you're making a book about mapping, making map plots, like not Matplotlib, but like maps and like showing things on maps.
Sure.
You could probably do a book just on that because there's a whole bunch of people who are interested in like GIS and visualization on those things, right? But it's not necessarily general purpose for everyone else. What I basically made the executive decision is like, I'm going to sort of leave that bucket on its own and cover the 80% of plot types that I think are most useful, which fell into those other four buckets, right? So again, line plots, scatter plots, bar plots, and histograms. And then what I did was I said, okay, I got a bunch of examples of those. I'm going to start figuring out why I like these plots, these ones that I collected. Why did I like those? And so the plots that I appreciate chapter was picking out some, I would say, semi-canonical examples from that.
Okay.
And sharing those. But hopefully the exercise that I want people to do when they go through that chapter is, everyone sees plots or visualizations almost every day, but sort of take a new frame of mind when you're doing that and sort of say, okay, I'm going to sort of like close my eyes and then open them. What's the first thing that I notice, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And pay attention to things like color or annotation, or if something is bolded versus not bolded, right? And if you do that, I think, then you start to pay attention. Oh, okay, so they made this color and everything else is like, they made this red and everything else is gray because they want to draw your attention to that. And then if I look at the title actually says, this bad thing is happening, reinforcing that red line that my eye is already pointing to, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times we just look at the plot, but we don't sort of tease apart like the theory behind the plot. The point of that chapter was, okay, start looking at plots not just as like, okay, this is a scatter plot and I call scatter and pass in two columns and I make a scatter plot, but like, why do they choose a scatter plot? And then what are the things that make the story interesting, or how can you tell the story or emphasize the story when you are making a scatter plot?
I think they're interesting examples. And one of the things I wanted to point out when you talked about, we see these things all the time, especially like we may see them in, Jupyter Notebook or other places as a developer or a data scientist. And usually they're just like one-off, like somebody just shot off this thing and it's like, okay, I see, I don't know, a relationship, but I don't necessarily see the story. And the advantage of seeing these more, I don't want to call them professionally done, but they're more display ready, like types of things, is you can feel the editing process. You can feel that there was someone else involved who looked at that thing and is like, well, what are you trying to say with this? And so forth. And that's hard if you're an individual to get that part through. And I think that's kind of what you're trying to do with the book. I feel like that's kind of coming across, is that here's what you should be paying attention to in order for your audience to get this thing and get something out of it. And so I appreciated that part of it, because I feel that a lot of the rest of the book is, well, how do we create things like this, and draw those elements out.
Yeah. And so what I did was I came up with a methodology, so to speak, of steps that, if you remember these, I think you can go through this process and you can apply them to your plot or your visualization. And as you're applying them, you can kind of ask yourself these questions. And I think it will take the rudimentary one-liner plot and push it towards that professional level plot, so to speak, if you apply those.
And that's your clear method?
Yeah, that's the clear method.
You want to dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the clear method, CLEAR, is, again, a mechanism for you to ask yourself questions when you're making your visualization in order to make sure that your visualization is telling a good story. And so the C stands for color. And one of the things that is super important with color is that like the defaults in a lot of tools actually are pretty bad for color, right?
Yep.
If I'm just going to do like a line plot and I do a line plot and there's like 50 different colors on there, that's not useful, right? Or if I want to pull attention to a certain aspect, oftentimes it's not straightforward to do that out of the box.
Yeah.
So color is also one of those things where we can use color to, I don't want to say cheat, so to speak, but you can use color to like force your audience to pay attention to things that
they have relationships with these colors already.
Yeah.
Based upon, temperatures or, how they've been classically deployed across their life.
Yeah. So generally, in the US, like red is sort of like warning or bad, right? Green is good, go sort of thing. But also like I can like make your eye go to a certain part of the plot if I use color, I would say intelligently, right? So part of that storytelling is learning some of the tricks, so to speak, of color and then how to apply that and make sure that you're telling your story appropriately using color. And, obviously there are a lot of things to be aware of with color, right? And things like color blindness or grayscale. And I think one of the cool things in my book, I've got some examples of code that you can take the code, and if you run the code with Matplotlib, it will convert your colors into like colorblind simulation colors, or convert it into like grayscale if you're printing it in black and white, and you can see, do these colors work in those situations as well.
We had one of our video instructors who is colorblind, and he would occasionally come across a written tutorial that he was going to turn into a video course. And he's like, I just want to point out that the colors that you've picked are impossible for me. He was having such a hard time differentiate between things, and he had to like completely shift them to make it work for them. And that's a real thing. It happens, often where, I used to play video games with a friend, and he had a certain kind of red-green kind of issue. And, depending on what they were doing in the color scheme in the game, and a lot of games are much smarter about this, as are these libraries and stuff like that. But it's just, often you would say something to him and he's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking for here.
Yeah.
So it's a key thing.
Yeah. And a lot of times I would say an issue with color is not actually adding more color. It's actually removing color, right?
Yeah.
Limiting the number of colors or desaturating things so that they're not so bright, or they're not like focusing on certain things with them. So that's the C. The next letter is L, and L stands for limited types of visualizations. We sort of talked about this already, but the insight that I had after I went through this process of going through like all of these bookmarks and websites, collecting all these examples is, I feel like a lot of people want to reach out and they're like, oh, there's this really cool plot and it's just so fancy. But really, I think based on my evidence that like professional visualization people aren't reaching for fancy plots to show how smart or intelligent they are. They're reaching for simple plots because these limited plots are the plots that, again, generally tell a story pretty easily without a lot of explanation.
Yeah.
And they're pretty well understood. I think a lot of people, if you can't tell a story with one of these 4 plots, again, I think for a good chunk of your cases, you should be able to do that. And if you can't, you should consider, do I want to try and tell a story with this plot, or should I revisit that? Or is it something like, this is a map and it really does make sense to put this plotted on projection of, some country or something like that?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, somewhat controversial in that, I would say like my Effective Pandas 2 book has more plot types in it than my Effective Visualization does, because in Effective Pandas 2, I sort of said, okay, here's a bunch of plots that you can make with pandas, right? Whereas here...
This is the menu.
Yeah, this is everything that's out there, right? But here I'm like, okay, you should really, really consider why you wouldn't want to use one of these plots, right? Which I would say is a pretty opinionated take, and I have seen some people are like, oh, why didn't you cover this type of plot? And again, I
think you're going to get some pushback on this one.
Yeah, my experience is that I don't cover it because I think a lot of people don't know how to use these other plots appropriately, and B, you can probably do it with this other plot more appropriately or tell the story better to folks better with that.
There are some really specialized things that are out there that are like in scientific fields that, hey, that's going to make sense and you need to do that here. But if you're going to, again, hit 90% or more target on this sort of stuff, if the chart type has to be explained to the general audience, then maybe we're going to miss huge amounts of people.
Yeah. So I had a bunch of people reviewing my book. One of them was from the pharmaceutical industry and said, Matt, pharmacy, they like to use box plots and you don't use box plots. And I was like, yeah. So I'm not saying like if you're in industry and there's like some industry standard of using box plots, go ahead and make box plots. Like they're not hard to use in Matplotlib, right? I think the general ideas that we talked about in the book will apply.
Yeah.
But I think there are some gaps with box plots that you should be aware of, and like oftentimes a well-constructed histogram will better display that distribution of the data than a box plot. But yeah, if there's some standard, I'm not saying violate the standard, but I'm saying be aware that like there's a reason why I think a histogram is better than a box plot generally.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Okay, so that's L, limited visualization types. The E in there in clear is for explanations or explanatory titles, subtitles, and annotations. I think this is one of the places where I would say the maybe citizen data scientists or developers or visualization people, when they're making their visualizations, this is probably one of the easiest places to get some better visualizations.
Yeah, really amplify what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, get the story across.
Yeah. So explain what you're trying to say, right? And when I went through that process of like going through all these visualizations, one thing that stood out to me that I didn't really think about before, this is like when you like pull back the curtains and you're like, oh, this is what people are doing, is they have a title and then they'll have a subtitle right below that. If you look at like these professional quality plots. And I'm like, oh, Matplotlib doesn't even like it has sort of like a title, but doesn't have like subtitle capabilities even in the, like, that's not a first class thing in the library, right? And I don't know very many plotting libraries where like that's a first class thing, but to these visualization experts, having a title and a subtitle is part of a visualization, right?
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that you're explaining what they just saw with the visualization, right? And it might be that you have a visualization about maybe temperatures changing over time, right? And so you can have a visualization that shows the temperature change over time, and then you can say the temperature's changed over time, and then you can have a subtitle that emphasizes certain things if you want to. And then there's also included in that is annotations, right? And this is another thing where if you go through that process of like, if you look at like plots and you close your eyes and you open your eyes and like, what do I look at? If there's an annotation on the plot, generally your eye will go to that annotation.
Right.
Because the designer has crafted them in a way such that they stand out, they're bolder, they're darker, or they're bigger, and they're pointing your eye to sort of the main point. So you can use that title, subtitle, and annotation to emphasize the point on top of using a simple plot that the audience will understand.
This is something that came up recently. I was talking about an example of improving the quality, how the plots look in Matplotlib, and the data was leaning more to the right. Mm-hmm. And the default is to have your tick marks on the left and on the bottom, but it may make sense because your eye is trying to get a scale of what's happening to have that the ticks on the right, or you may want to add graph lines inside there or other things like that. I'm probably not even saying the words all correctly because I don't have them in my head right now. But yeah, just stuff like that, just to like make it scannable and readable quickly. And yeah, I feel like that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't consider that, like, we want to be able to quickly, like, if you have to sit there and look at a plot for a long time, oftentimes that's a bad plot, right? If you can't just sort of look at it and figure out what's going on, if you have to think about it often, not always, but often, you could have done something better probably.
Yeah. Along these lines, I had a couple of people from this project that's called Great Tables. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Yeah. And I feel like it does a lot of this stuff inside there. They go out of their way to, again, make display ready, tables, something that's not just a straight up data frame or an Excel sheet looking kind of thing, where you're able to do a lot by highlighting things, having those subtitles, having annotations, having all this sort of like really nice formatting stuff. And I feel like that's kind of this goal that I have that is somewhat missing in a lot of the visualization libraries, is like, you kind of out of the box, like the stuff that you get there, you're going to need to do a little more work.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the Great Tables project, awesome project. I've talked with the creators of that. And in fact, one of the reviewers of my book said, you should have used Great Tables in your book for displaying tables. And I guess I would say that, again, going back to like my opinionated take on that, it's not that like I'm trying to make bad tables in the book. The tables in the book that I'm showing are actually like Pandas data frames. And someone said you should like Great Tableize those data frames in them.
Okay.
And they're like, it's a book about visualization, so your tables should look good. And I guess my take was, well, I kind of put like, first of all, like, if I'm showing someone a table, I want to have a reason for showing them a table.
Right.
And again, oftentimes I think it's better to show them a visualization rather than the table, right? So the tables I'm including in my book aren't like, I'm not showing you this table because like I want you to scan through this table and look at the data in the table and like draw conclusions from it. I'm showing tables in the book because I'm illustrating how to do Pandas operations, and this is the output of the Pandas that you might need to know in order to follow along or make your own table.
It's not the focus.
Yeah. Another library that is useful, that like going on that Matplotlib out of the box doesn't like necessarily help you do like titles and subtitles, whereas like Great Tables is like focused on like publication quality stuff, right?
Yeah.
Is the highlight text library. And I think a lot of people aren't aware of this library, highlight text.
Okay.
But I'll just make brief mention of it because I think it's pretty cool. But one of the cool things that you can do with this is you can give it a block of text to throw onto Matplotlib. So it's kind of built on top of Matplotlib. But in Matplotlib, you have to like make, here's your text, and it all has to be styled the same. With this library, you can say, here's a block, and you wrap it in like less than, greater than. So you say, inside of that little group, apply this formatting to it.
Okay.
And inside of this one, apply this formatting to it. And so that's a nice library where you can like make a title and a subtitle in the same call, right?
Yeah.
And have them be like formatted, where one is like maybe slightly larger or bolder and the other one's smaller, but it's right below it. And you can like add new lines, and you can change the color of them, all of that really easily.
Okay.
And Matplotlib, you could try to do that with Matplotlib, but you're going to jump through. Like generally, I try and limit the amount of libraries that I'm like using here. Like generally, it's like, again, exploiting Matplotlib and Pandas is the subtitle here. But I think that highlight text library is, if listeners haven't heard of that and they're using Matplotlib, it's a good one to check out.
Cool. We'll definitely include links to that.
Yeah.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It's related to our main discussion this week about Matplotlib and creating visualizations in Python. The course is titled Using Plot.Scatter to Visualize Data in Python. It's based on a tutorial by previous guest and real Python team member Stephen Grappetta. And in the video course, Darren Jones takes you through how to create a scatter plot using plot.scatter, using the required and optional input parameters, customizing scatter plots for basic and more advanced plots, how to represent more than 2 dimensions on a scatter plot. Throughout the course, you'll walk through several examples that'll show you how to use the techniques effectively. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed, include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com.
Okay, so we've done C, color, L for limited visualizations, E for explanations with titles and subtitles and annotations.
Yeah.
So we're on A, and A is your audience. And so some people might say that this is an excuse for making poor plots. Maybe it is, but I think you need to consider your audience when you're making a plot. And oftentimes, like maybe 95% of the time, your audience is just you doing some exploratory data analysis or something like that.
Right.
And you don't need to go through all these steps of making a title and a subtitle, right? I don't need to tell myself that, right? When the audience is just me.
Yeah.
But to your point, like if your audience is a general audience or your audience is pharmaceutical folks,
right,
then you need to know that, and you need to know what stories you need to tell them, what you're assuming they know, and
what their expectations are,
what their expectations are, and cater the plot to your audience, right?
Yeah.
And I think generally you want, like if you say that your visualization does not have an audience, like if you go through those questions that I provide on each of these, and you say like, my visualization doesn't have an audience, like it's universal or whatnot, then I would say that it's probably a bad visualization, or you really haven't given thought to that.
Yeah. You haven't thought about who's going to look at it.
Yeah. So that is one of those questions that, like, if you think about that, that can help give you some guidance.
Yeah. Often I feel like these things are going to be, well, at least in some of the work I've done in an office environment, which isn't a lot, you would be presenting this to, somebody higher up the food chain as far as, management and so forth, or a boss. And so making sure that if they're not a subject matter expert, having the titles and subtitles and annotations so they can kind of understand it. That's sort of the goal here, not to dumb something down, but to, make it explicit, again, make it quick.
Exactly.
You're the person taking the time to make it. They shouldn't be the person taking the time to understand it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you and generally, like I say this all the time when I'm teaching a class, like when you talk about like aggregations, like your boss, like if you're at a candy store and you're like giving a report on like how the sales went for the day, the boss doesn't want to know that Sally came in about a Tootsie Roll and a gumball and a lollipop, right, and then Tommy came in.
They don't want to log.
Yeah. They're like, I don't care about that. I want the summary, right? I want the aggregated results. And I think visualizations can serve that same function, right? Like here's a visualization that tells you yearly sales or by quarterly sales over the past 2 years, right? And if you want to dig into a table, right, we can give you a table with a spreadsheet behind it, but you probably don't want that, right? We're looking for trends or patterns here. We're not picking through the cells of a table.
Yeah. This is where I got very excited about visualizations, and I tended to, and this is based upon the boss that I had, to want to make them interactive. Mm-hmm. This particular person wanted to tease stuff and wanted to be able to tear it apart. So I ended up leaning toward like Bokeh and some of these other libraries that allowed you to kind of do that.
Yeah.
But often in the end, we would show this tool to another person. And again, maybe they were higher up or whatever, and they would just sort of like not touch it. And you're like, touch it, interact with it. And they're just like, I'm not, I don't want to learn this skill right now, and so forth. And so it's really, again, that kind of goes back to the audience thing. And so I found that interesting in your book. You're like, okay, I'm not going to get into the interactive thing because, that's literally a whole other set of, book and cross purposes, maybe in some senses. Like now you got to teach the person, well, how do they interact with it and play with it, which is a whole other separate thing. And maybe that involves like, okay, I got to have like some kind of control panel as opposed to like them having to learn what the library does.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So the interactivity, first of all, I'm going to come out and say it. This might hurt some people's feelings, but like Matplotlib is not great for interactivity. And if you're looking to do something for interactivity, something like Bokeh is probably a better choice, or something like Plotly, something where it's actually architected with interactivity in mind.
It's a dashboarding kind of thing as opposed to a plot library.
Yeah. So, but I think even still, like if you want interactivity, you need to like know your audience, right? Because if the audience is like, we made this interactive dashboard, and the audience is like, I don't want to learn that, right?
Right. I don't learn how to drive that car.
Yeah. It's like, okay, maybe we didn't create the right thing. Yeah. So on that, the book is focused on Matplotlib. It's not focused on interactivity, even though Matplotlib claims to have, interactivity. Every time I've worked with clients who have tried using the Matplotlib interactivity, they've always gone to something like Bokeh or Plotly, just because it's a better solution for that, that type of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of designed a little more around that.
Yeah. Okay, so we've done CLEA, the A for audience. The last one is R, so clear. The R is for references. And I think this one's pretty important these days. So one of the plots that I include in there is from the New York Times, and it's actually the first plot in the book. And some of my reviewers gave me some pushback on the plot. They're like, I don't like this plot, or like it's too political or whatnot. And because what it shows two histograms. It shows this is a histogram from some time period, and this is a histogram from a more recent time period, and the temperature has shifted.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, that's fine. I mean, the plot has a reference, right? So you can actually go in and you can go to some PhD researcher and find what they were doing, because the actual New York Times plot was actually based on what some researchers were doing. So it's kind of cool that like they took like scientific plots and like actually applied some of these tools to make it like pretty for a more general audience. So one of the things, one of the activities I do in my histogram chapter in the book is I recreate the plot. And I think recreating a plot is a awesome way to learn.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about this part. Yeah.
And so instead of using the data they use, I actually use my local data at Salt Lake City. So I went out and grabbed the local data from Salt Lake City and recreated the plot. The plot looks a little bit different, but I did see a shift in that, right? And so, and that's
the time periods were the same.
Time periods were the same, but we saw like a shift similar to that. And I can put like the little reference there. This is from the NOAA data from Salt Lake City, right? And that's one of the things. If you're telling a story, it's like, this is what the data is telling me, right? I mean, you can say it's political or whatnot, but this is what the data is telling me. You can go out and grab the data. You can do that. The book has the code to recreate that if you want to. But I think if you are telling a story, especially if you're in like a business setting, that sort of thing, you just want to put a little reference at the bottom of your plot. And again, when I was going through all these plots, I noticed all of these plots at the very bottom in small text would have a little thing that said, this is the data. This is maybe some of the things we did with the data, right? And just made it clear that like, we're not just pulling this data out of thin air. This is what's going on with the data.
Yeah.
And again, Matplotlib doesn't have like references aren't a part of a plot in Matplotlib, right? So this is one of those things where you've got to go in after the fact and use some like text annotation tool or whatnot, and throw that on there.
Is that what you ended up doing for some of the examples that you ended up creating?
Yeah. So just, and this doesn't, again, know your audience. If I'm making a plot for myself, I don't really need to put that on there. But I think if you are making this for someone who's not yourself, right, you probably want to have some sort of annotation at the bottom that's just saying like, this is where the data came from. And I think it certainly adds an air of legitimacy to your plot. And I think we should also, like as an educator, I'm open to learning, right? And if someone else can go in and take that same data and do a better plot or better visualization from it or have further insights from that, I think that's awesome, right? So I'm all for encouraging not hiding things, but also, encouraging others to participate or improve and collaborate as well.
Yeah. Across the book, you have, I think you maybe reference them as recipes.
Mm-hmm.
You have a bunch of these projects across the whole book. I know you wanted to hit all these different types, but were there other, factors that went into it and in this idea of, building recipes for people to practice and go through?
So what factors went into like choosing what to visualize?
Yeah. And I guess, how did you decide on the library of things that you wanted to build into this bunch of recipes?
Yeah. So again, it was after I determined that like these are the 4 plots that I'm going to do. Then I kind of said, okay, each of those plots is going to be a chapter-ish, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Sort of devoted to like exploring that type of plot. And then, there's some thoughts about like what does the plot try and tell, right? For example, with a histogram, we're generally looking at like a distribution of the data. So we want to see like how the data is distributed. And oftentimes people might want to know whether something is normal or not. And so I do have content where I like dive into like, okay, let's talk about like what we can do to maybe compare 2 histograms or compare a histogram to a normal distribution and see if it's normal or not, or scientific tests that we can do something like that.
Okay.
Or tease apart other, I think, good examples of histograms and talk about how or why we might want to do something like that. So for example, like in the histogram, I have that temperature one. And the temperature one is actually kind of tricky because the temperature one, to actually recreate it, you can't actually use a histogram to recreate it. Just due to its...
Because there's 2 sets of data? Or what?
Because of how they colored it.
Okay.
in the histogram, they colored it where like it's temperatures and the like normal, not normal as a normal curve, but like the middle temperatures that are like the average or so temperatures, they put in like a gray color. And then the cold temperatures, they put in a blue color, and the hot temperatures, they put in a red color. And then when they showed the more recent histogram, you would see that like there was more red because it had shifted to the red, so to speak.
Okay.
But Matplotlib doesn't have any capability of making a histogram that's not one color.
Okay. You can't like choose like these number of bins have...
Yeah, you can't say bins X through Y are this color and bins whatever are this color, right? And so I had to make like a filled line plot and converted the data from the histogram, the bins from that, using pandas, and then plotted a line plot and then filled under it with those colors. And Matplotlib does have the capability of doing that.
Okay.
So I kind of went through a similar process where I said, okay, let's take a few canonical examples of these different plots and maybe explore them and talk about the process for doing them. Another fun one to do is in the scatter plots. There's a scatter plot of polling data from Russian elections. And this one was inspired by, I think, in New York Times or an Economist plot. But again, some academic had originally done the research on this. And what you see if you scatter plot the percent of people who turned out to vote and the percent who voted in favor of this plot was that you would, when you did the scatter plot, if you can adjust the alpha and the size of the plots in there, you actually see like lines going through this, like 95% voted yes, right?
Right.
95 and 90 and 85, and there's like,
it doesn't seem as scattered at that moment.
You see a blob of data, but then you see these lines going through there and you're like, what's going on there, right? And then you like go and do a histogram of that and you see these peaks going on there, and you're like, okay, so statistically it would be very hard for those lines to just naturally appear, right? And this is an example of stuff that like that plot, when I generally show it to people, like I said, look at this plot, and they look at it and they're like, I mean, you can literally see like their eyes go, like their head explode, because it's like, that's telling a story, right? And it's
we decided to to put something on the 5s or the 10s.
Yeah. But again, if you were to say like, okay, I'm just going to give you the Great Tables version of that data, right? And here's whatever 50,000 rows has the Great Tables data of that.
Right.
The Great Tables data might look great,
Yeah.
right? But no one's going to come away with those insights from looking at the table of the data.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you could do the histogram and get one type of result where you're seeing these strange peaks, if you will, and then the other version, when you actually do the scatter, it really shows off like, how did we get a grid?
Yeah. Why is there a grid on the scatter plot that should be just like random points on there, right?
That's pretty wild.
So that's kind of the fun thing is like, I think another really cool technique for folks is to like practice this, right?
So I was thinking about like, do you think it's a good technique to do this, to like take existing visualizations that people see and then try to recreate them?
Yeah, I think if you want to get better at visualizations, right? There's that idea of like copying, stealing the Picasso quote.
Right.
And I think if you go out and say, here's a plot I like, let's try and recreate that, it's going to be a good learning experience, right? You're gonna learn, first of all, that like getting a good plot is more than just one line of code generally, right? I mean, and we kind of already talked about that because like you don't have first class support for things like subtitles and like references and that sort of thing. But even things like coloring things in the non-native coloring, which you generally want to do, it typically turns out to be a little bit more complicated than the defaults there.
Yeah, I'm sure the color part is a pretty big portion of what you're digging into, and that's where you start to get into a little bit of the color theory. We talked about the idea of having be ready for color blindness. There are some techniques that I was wondering, I didn't get as deep into the book as I wanted to over the last week or so, but do you use the technique that I think is really nice, which is called the style sheets? Is that something that you discuss in there?
Yeah, so one of the things that Matplotlib has support for is style sheets, and I've used this for clients in the past. So style sheets, if you're not aware of them, are basically, Matplotlib has defaults for a lot of things. So there's like, I don't know, probably 300 or 400 things that are just defaulted. When you make a line plot, when you make a plot, it has a default for the size, it has a default for how thick the ticks are, it has a default for font settings, it has a default for what colors it's going to use and font sizes. All of these things are kind of defaulted, and you can go in and you can configure those. You can configure those at runtime. You can use a context manager to temporarily override them, or you can make style sheets as well. And like for clients in the past, I've gone through and made style sheets so that when they made a plot and they tried to plot like line plots or bar plots, it would use their corporate colors by default.
Yeah.
And it would use their font by default when they're doing that. So the format of the book is there's the sort of introduction where we talk about the theory and the clear, and I show those examples. And then there's 2 chapters on Matplotlib. One is like, here's, I think, the basics of Matplotlib that, you just kind of need to know this if you're going to making plots. And then there's another Matplotlib chapter, which is, I would say, like kind of the rest of Matplotlib. It's not the rest of Matplotlib, but it's like what I think is like, here's the other 80% of Matplotlib that you should probably know.
Yeah. If I'm going to give you advice, this is where you should be looking.
Yeah. And in that section, we talk about style sheets and how to use them, how to reset them, where they're located, those sorts of things. Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to hit on, again, with this idea of like, maybe recreating things or kind of working on your own. And there's a ton of stuff in the book for people to work through with the code, with the data. But if you go outside of that and you want to find data to practice with, did you find other sources for data? A common one that comes up in the data science world is Kaggle.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked about tidy data and these sort of challenges. Sometimes they'll find different sources, but do you have any suggestions for people looking for data to practice with?
Yeah, I mean, Kaggle is sort of the nice thing about Kaggle, if you're not aware of it, it's a subsidiary of Google that hosts machine learning competitions, and oftentimes these competitions have data, and the data is sort of sitting there that people can leverage that data. So the nice thing about Kaggle is that oftentimes there's corresponding notebooks that show people like going through and doing exploratory data analysis on the data. And like, I know that some of my students and some of the classes I teach have like used Kaggle data, but they've also been, there's all these people showing all these different plots. So let's kind of like take those plots and like use those. So those are, I think, great places for sort of trying stuff out. Other places for getting data. So a general hint that I give to folks is just like search for something and then tack on like CSV after it in like a search, right? And so generally, if you do that, since comma-separated values are like a file format, it tends to show more file formats.
I do a trick with that with when I'm looking for a manual for something that I can't find, I'll put .pdf in my search, because I'm like, I really don't want, an explainer. I really want a file.
So there's that tends to work pretty good. Not that CSVs are the world's greatest thing, but I think there's a lot of data sitting in CSVs and we can access it relatively easily in the Python world. There's a lot of data sort of sitting around in different places on GitHub.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So oftentimes those searches will pull up stuff on GitHub. Some of these, like New York Times, The Economist, actually have data science teams, and some of them have posted content to their GitHub repositories. There's stuff like NOAA, which is National Oceanographic Atmospheric Association. They have a bunch of data. That's generally where I get like temperature, climate data. So like that Salt Lake City data, I got that there.
Okay.
Where else have I gotten data? Well, I mean, one thing that you can do these days is you can use AI to generate fake data.
Yeah.
Which, depending on how you prompt it,
lets you play with stuff at least. Yeah.
Well, I'm also a fan of using my own data.
Okay.
Depending on things that you're using. So like one of the things I show in my book, I don't give the data for this, but I show that I did this, is like my sales data.
Okay.
So I like show how I analyze my sales data, but it's anonymized real sales data that I show how like this is how you might want to visualize that. Another thing that I've been doing a lot recently is like Strava data.
Okay. Exercise stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I got a dump of my Strava data and have that for me. I'm not necessarily saying that like you want to go out and like, if it has personal private stuff and I'm not saying throw that out there, but I'm saying that might be something fun to use.
Yeah. I have a little weather station. I've been thinking about tracking it, and there's all these kind of sensors that kind of get into the whole Circuit Python world and stuff like that could kind of relate to it. Yeah, cool.
Yeah. One piece of advice that I give to folks when they're like, we just did like a pandas class or a visualization class. And, I say like, okay, you've got like a lot of this theory and examples in your head, but you need to go out and practice, right? I think some self-reflection sort of similar to like looking at these plots and like thinking about what you're doing when you're looking at them, but also thinking about like what motivates Matt as a person to do something, right?
Yeah.
And like for me, it's like, something that's work related. So like looking at my actual sales data, or something that's maybe hobby related, looking at my Strava data, right? Those kind of motivate me to like, not just sit down and binge Netflix, but actually go out and do this, right? So I would say like, give it some thought to yourself. What would motivate me, right? Would it be like, is it data that's sitting around in a spreadsheet at work, right? Or in a database? Or is there like, personal data that might be interesting for me? And then I can go out and like recreate or attempt to recreate some of these plots or techniques using this data that's motivating to me. That might be a good way to, rather than just saying, here's random data, right?
Yeah.
Random data might not be super interesting to you, but if you're getting insights into, look, this is how my exercises went. Or one cool thing that I did, and I'll just give a small anecdote. So I ride bikes with our high school mountain bike team.
Okay.
And so, I have the Strava data for that, but I just did a really simple plot of how far I've ridden bikes on an e-bike versus a normal bike. So recently got an e-bike, and I looked and like I rode like twice as much with an e-bike as I did with a normal bike, right? And then you might say like, e-bikes are for wimps or whatever, but for me, it got me out a lot more, right? And so that was kind of a cool insight.
Yeah, I think it's, if you're out there doing it for longer, there's still a lot of,
Yeah.
there's still a lot of exercise inside of that.
Yeah, riding a mountain e-bike is definitely like, there is a lot of exercise in that. So, but it was just an example of like, oh, that's a cool insight that I didn't know.
Yeah.
But then it's like,
you're getting outside and doing stuff. Yeah.
It's like, more, this investment in this bike, like made me get out more. Right. So maybe that's worth it for me. So that's an example of using personal data to come up with insights that you might not otherwise.
Yeah. How can people get the book?
Yeah, so the book is available on my website. So that's if you go to store.metasnake.com, there's a link to the book there.
Okay.
That's a digital book. There's also a corresponding course and a live course as well that I'm going to be doing some live workshops if people are interested in that. And then a physical version is on Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah.
One thing that we talked a lot about, I think this was maybe, I don't know, it was both the books that you've been on before talking about, but this book is full of color again. So be aware. You're probably not going to want the Kindle version of this book.
Yeah, at least not. Is at least not the paperwhite version.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Matt, I'm going to ask you the questions that we hit every time here. Yeah. So what's something that you're excited about that's happening in the world of Python?
Yeah, I would say something that I'm excited about in Python is I'm really liking this Rustification of things, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I know you had like UV folks on here a while ago.
Yeah. Charlie was on a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
I've been using UV in some of my courses. It's pretty awesome, like just how quick it is. But I've been using Python almost 25 years, and it's cool that like 25 years in, you can have something that's like, this actually makes a material difference in like how I use my tools. And I appreciate that. Yeah. So polars would be another example of that, right? Like Python has great things going for it, but Python is slow. And, if people can give us tools that allow us to stay in our language, but also get things done quicker, that's super awesome. And so I'm really liking that, what I'm seeing there.
Yeah, me too. I've been thinking about getting some of the people that are involved in Pixie, just sort of the data science side of that stuff, sort of the Mamba, Conda.
Yeah.
But kind of rustified, I think. So I got to learn more about it, but I'm going to look at that.
Yeah.
Cool. So what's something that you want to learn next?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I could clone myself, or maybe I can make an AI.
Sure.
So one of the things you're talking about CircuitPython, I would like to probably have to be like a Raspberry Pi type thing, but
sure.
I think it would be fun as someone who records a lot of videos and still says and other things. I was thinking, okay, how could I like prevent myself from doing that? I guess I just need to practice more, be more self-aware of that. But I was thinking another thing I could do is I could make like some little computer that's just sitting there, sort of like the Alexa. But when it hears
it throws a little red light.
It throws a red light, and I'm like, oh yeah, stop doing that, right? And I just put it right on top of my monitor. So yeah, that's something that I've like looked into the hardware and
yeah.
But it's a project that I'd like to do. Yeah.
Cool. So what's the best way that people can follow the work that you do online?
Yeah, I'm available on lots of social media. So I guess formerly known as Twitter, I'm still around there. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on LinkedIn. Probably the best place if you're interested in like my content. If you go to metasnake.com, I have a mailing list there and have content there as well.
Yeah. You're pretty regular about putting stuff out. So that's great.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, thanks again for coming back on the show. It's been great to talk to you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
And don't forget, Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform. And they just launched Postman AI, Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. Start building at postman.com/podcast/Python. I want to thank Matt Harrison for coming back on the show this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python Podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python Podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.